Good morning, everybody. So today we're going to cover Chapter 4, which is on civil liberties. So let's take a look at that PowerPoint. Discuss some of the issues. So let's go over this. Civil liberties is going to be explained, and then I'll also differ it from civil rights, state the constitutional basis for our civil liberties. Then I'll go over the key ones in the First Amendment, such as the religious freedoms, Establishment Clause, and the Free Exercise Clause, and then how the courts have interpreted those freedoms. So there will be a lot of mention of Supreme Court cases. And then we'll discuss free speech, and you have one or two or three speech cases, I think Schenck and Brandenburg, that'll be coming up. But I'll describe how freedom of speech is protected and show how the courts have implemented that freedom. And then we'll discuss why Americans are concerned about privacy rights. It's a big issue right now with all technology and the big tech companies basically censoring people and controlling, and also government gathering information on us, metadata, through programs like PRISM. And then we'll summarize how the Constitution and the Bill of Rights protects the rights of the accused before, during, and after the whole criminal process happens. So let's jump right in. Let's look at the constitutional basis for our civil liberties and civil rights and legal privileges. Then we'll get into some safeguards in the original Constitution, the one without the Bill of Rights, that you're not aware of, that are probably, some of them sound familiar to you, but you don't know what they are exactly. Then we'll talk about the Bill of Rights, and then something called the incorporation issue, which is, I'll get into that in a little while. But first, let's get into the definitions of civil liberties and civil rights. Civil liberties are protections that are written in the Constitution of the United States against government action, protections that forbid the federal government from doing certain things. It's a protection. It's a prophylactic against intrusion into our lives, our ways of doing business by the federal government. It's statements of what the government can and cannot do, really what they cannot do, really. So that's what civil liberties are. They're limitations on government action. Let's say that again. They are limitations on government action. They're not what government can do. Although some politicians would like to have a Bill of Rights for government, no such thing really exists. The only thing that exists is the Constitution, which outlines the three branches of government. That's what government can do and no more. But the civil liberties contained in the Constitution are what government cannot do. Okay. Now, civil rights, which we'll get into in Chapter 5, these are things that government must do. So governments must carry out certain things in order to protect the civil liberties of certain people, all people. And now legal privileges are things that can be taken away, such as a driver's license, and they can be denied as well. We do not give driver's license to the visual impaired cannot do that. That is not, you don't have a right to a driver's license. You're privileged to drive on the streets, and it can be taken away. If you have too many DWIs, your license can be taken away. Okay, now we'll get into the safeguards in the original Constitution. There's three that I want you to know. The first is the writ habeas corpus. Now, this is an ancient writ, and it's been around for a while because of the abuses of governments. Governments would put you away in the past, and you'd never see the light of day because of you were considered an undesirable because you were a threat to the government structure, the power structure. So oftentimes governments have put people in prison and thrown away the key, as they say, and not charged a person with crimes, misdemeanors, felonies. Or they've done them, but they're too busy, or they don't want to because they're afraid of the consequence of putting the person on public trial. They just keep them incognito, put them away. So over time, it developed the necessity amongst human beings that I have a right to life, I have a right to my freedom to pursue happiness, and I can't do that if I'm in jail. So this writ of habeas corpus, which has been around for, like I said, a long time, and is at least in the Anglo-American tradition since 1215, and on paper, it requires an official to bring a specified prisoner person into court, and the jailer, the government, the executive branch, the king, the monarch, the executive branch, whoever that is, they must explain the reason why you're holding this person in jail before a judge, before a court. Now, it is available to all citizens except in times of rebellion or national invasion. So during riots, like we see in cities across the country, there are times when the police can hold you for a longer period of 24, 48, and so on, hours, in case there's a problem. Now, the second is the Bill of Attainder. In the past, what happened was that legislatures or councils of nobles would do certain things that inflicted punishment on a particular person, a particular group, and would not grant them trial. And this is patently unfair and was perceived as such. And so, again, long ago, in ancient times, maybe even before classical Rome, Greece, many felt that such things passed in the Senate of Rome, or councils that inflicts punishment on a particular person without giving them the right to trial is unfair, unjust. And so there developed a theory in Anglo-American jurisprudence that this is something that should be guaranteed to all citizens. Governments cannot violate this. So in our Constitution, it says that, yeah, Congress and the state legislatures are prohibited from passing a Bill of Attainder. Now, the third thing that is in the original Constitution, the first 5 pages, the 5th page is just a letter of transmittal, but in those first 4 pages, there's also this final thing that an ex post facto law cannot be passed. You cannot punish individuals for committing an act that was legal when the act was committed. You cannot increase punishment. You cannot extend punishment by law and say to the persons in prison serving a sentence, a determinate sentence of 10 years, well, we have a new law that says for the crime you did, it's now 15 years. And you're going to have to stay an extra 5 years. No, you can't do that. So an ex post facto law is also prohibited. Congress is prohibited. Now, the founding fathers submitted the Constitution, as you recall, from Chapter 2 to the states, and the state ratifying conventions had a lot of disagreements over the Constitution. They thought it was too powerful, many of the founding fathers, and so they were known as the Anti-Federalists, and they made a big stink about it. Now, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay and others were no dummies, and they realized that they got to make some changes here, but they didn't want to go back to the drawing board. So what they did was they said, what we'll do is we'll promise that we'll add things to the Constitution in the first Congress, and then the states can approve it or not, as we saw in the end of Chapter 2 by 3/4 of the state legislatures. So if you really want some additions, we'll suggest some things that you're bringing up. And so by the first Congress of 1789, very quickly Madison wrote up, I forget, dozens of amendments, and 12 were written down, and 10 were finally adopted and put into the Constitution. Now, they weren't put into the certain sections where they maybe properly belonged. They were just, here's the extra page, and this is part of the Constitution. We call the first 10 amendments the Bill of Rights, but they are more than a Bill of Rights saying, okay, government must do this. They're also protections of civil liberties. So there is a little bit of nomenclature that you have to get clear in your mind. We'll go over the liberties, focus on those, and talk about the rights at the end of this chapter. Let's go over the first 10 amendments very quickly. The first one deals with the religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. So it's all about those things. We'll go over those in a moment. The Second Amendment, which of course is the gun amendment, actually says that states can have a militia and the people have the right to bear arms. It probably wasn't written very well, but if you read it, you'll understand it a little better. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So if you read those three clauses before the words shall not be infringed, you can see that they're talking about specific things. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, and the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's really what it means, and that's how the courts have interpreted it. The third deals with the quartering of soldiers, which was a big problem since the beginning of mankind. Governments would quarter troops, and they could eat a homeowner out of his sustenance, leave him destitute. So there's no soldiers coming into my house except in a manner prescribed by law. So it has to be clearly stated. The law has to be stated what, how long, for what reasons, this is how much food they can take, and so on. Searches and seizures, we'll get into that at the end of the chapter. We'll talk about that more. And 5 deals with the grand juries, double jeopardy, and so on. And then Amendment 6, criminal court procedures. So these 3 together, the 4th, 5th, and 6th, deal with a lot of criminal processes. And the 7th deals with civil cases. You are to get a trial by jury in civil cases. Amendment 8 deals with cruel and unusual punishment, again, the criminal process. And 9 and 10, 9 deals with the rights retained by the people, 10, the reserved powers of the states, which was dealt with in Chapter 3. Now, the Supreme Court has the final determination on the interpretation of the Bill of Rights, and we'll read about that in this chapter. Now, for uh, a long time in our country, this may sound as a shock to you. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights applied to the federal government, mostly. There are a few things in there about states. States cannot do this. States cannot tax another state's imports, those kinds of things. Those are in the Constitution. But the federal Constitution, by and large, was something that created the national government, because the states existed before they created this national government. And naturally, they kept a lot of powers themselves, those reserved powers in the 10th Amendment. And that's how the court interpreted it. In 1833, in the Barron versus Baltimore case, the court made it clear that this Constitution clearly applied to the national government. In the case of Barron versus Baltimore, Barron owned property on the Baltimore beachfront and was in charge of a wharf that unloaded supplies and so on. And Baltimore was going to do some work on the piers, on the docks, and that would have interfered with Barron's right to use and dispose of his property. So he sued, saying that, hey, you're not giving me due process of law, as it says in the Fifth Amendment. And the court said, no, you're going to have to go to Baltimore to discuss this issue, settle it with them. If the city and state want to do certain things, that's up to them. It's their decision. They're the people, the official that you have to deal with. This is not a federal issue. The Fifth Amendment doesn't apply to the city of Baltimore, the state of Maryland. So for quite a while, the Constitution was understood by law professors and lawyers and governors and legislators and everybody that it applied to just the national government. It had restrictions upon what the federal government could do and required them to do certain things when it came to criminal procedures. Now that began to change because of one event, the Civil War, which brought about the end of slavery, but also brought about the 14th Amendment. After the Civil War, the legislatures adopted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments very quickly over a 5-year period. The 13th was supposed to eliminate slavery and elevate the African American males to the same political status as white adult males, but it didn't do that in many states because of prejudices and control that the states wanted to have over that segment of the population. And so there began a series of laws passed in those states that would deny certain equal access to the courts for the African American males. And this caught the attention of many in the North. They were furious that the southern states primarily didn't abide by the 13th Amendment. So they decided, well, we're going to pass a 14th Amendment and we're going to put things in there. So they specifically put in things like a due process clause that says state governments must protect their citizens' rights. It says no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is reading from page 76 here. And so the lawyers and everybody looked at this and said, okay, we have this 14th Amendment. How do we interpret it? Well, that's taken 150 years to figure out. And it's still going on, constantly reinterpreted in many different ways. That's the incorporation principle. Well, how do we interpret that? What does that mean? And oftentimes what it means is the first 10 amendments get applied to the states. That's basically what the incorporation principle means. We're going to take portions of the first 10 amendments, freedom of religion, free exercise, speech, and in this instance, we're going to say this is what it means and it applies to this state and all the other states, because the 14th Amendment doesn't discriminate, it just says no state shall deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So this due process of law clause, it requires citizens to gain access to the courts and be treated equally by the state courts. At first, of course, it was really intended to bring up the African American male to the white males and give them equal access to the courts to buy property, dispose of property, make wills, have them enforced in the courts. So government is supposed to be fair, reasonable, have standard procedures when it takes legal actions. Now, over time, what has happened is the courts have developed two due process interpretations. Now, this is a real stretch, and in legalese, this is called procedural and substantive due process. That's what they're called. What has happened over the years is that the courts have looked at decisions in the state courts, and they've seen how life, liberty, and property is looked at, and they determine whether they have made equitably by other courts and executive branch agencies. Meaning, have these courts, these executive branch agencies done things equitably and fairly? So what happens is the Supreme Court, well, in cases like the 1932 case, right to a lawyer, in capital punishment cases, in the Powell versus Alabama case, which dealt with the Sixth Amendment there in table 4-2, they've looked at it and said, well, we feel that in order to have a fair process, in order to have Powell receive adequate treatment and a fair trial, to get a fair trial in the state of Alabama, you're going to have to, in capital punishment cases, so they're only dealing with a specific amendment, and we're dealing with the Eighth Amendment, and we're only dealing with capital punishment, which could mean, of course, the death penalty. You do have a right to a lawyer. So as they applied it to Alabama, it becomes applicable to all the states. So this is a device by which the courts, the Supreme Court, and the lower courts, federal courts now, have come about to interpret the 14th Amendment. So processes that they feel should be used by the states are now going to have to be used by the states. So the Supreme Court determines, is a law being applied? Is it fair? Is there a process being done fairly by the judiciary, by the executive branch, the sheriffs, and so on? So that's procedural due process. Now there's another one called substantive due process. It's a different side of the same coin. And in that, the court focuses on the content or substance of legislation. So they determine, does the city, the county, the school district, the township, the state, the territory, is it doing something? Is it passing laws which are fair and just? And basically the courts are telling governments, these lower governments, what they may do and may not do. That's pretty much what it is. So that's substantive due process. like in the case of, let's see, separation of church and state, or freedom of speech, as we'll see in a moment. In this case, freedom of speech, in the Gitlow case, here's Gitlow pictured here talking to an audience in New York in 1925. The courts looked at that and said that Gitlow's free speech, First Amendment rights cannot be interfered with by the state government of New York. He's speaking bad about government, but he's allowed to do that up to a certain point. Another one would be the Everson case, as I mentioned, the 1947 case. In that one, Everson versus Board of Education, dealing with the Establishment Clause, the court said that you cannot tax people and provide that tax money to a church. Governments cannot do that. A city, a township cannot tax people for the support, in this case, of a parochial school and something it was doing. I believe they were busing students. So you can't use a portion of your tax dollars to do those kinds of things. So here the courts are saying what a government can and cannot do. Specifically a state legislature. Now there are other liberties guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, and they've been incorporated and applied by the states by virtue of this 14th Amendment. However, there's been a couple that have not been. The right to a grand jury trial is not incorporated, although many states already guarantee that. Texas does. I don't know of any state that doesn't offer a grand jury before you're indicted for felonies. Misdemeanors may be a different matter, though. The right to refuse to quarter soldiers is fully guaranteed in a few states. And the right to bear arms was recently clearly incorporated in the Heller case in 2010. Now, as far as non-citizens, they have limited protections. They can be deported even if their presence is lawful. So even if they are legally here with a green card or HB1 visa and so on, they can be deported. In a 1903 Supreme Court ruling, the government cannot deport without a hearing that meets constitutional standards, but that's pretty flexible. Now, the courts often accept arguments of non-citizens. They cannot make constitutional claims. Well, let's go on to the protections of the First Amendment, religion, expression, and the press. Religion in the United States is an interesting story. We've had states which had state religions that were recognized as state religions. They were supported by the state legislatures, the cities, the communities, financially supported them, and the state required you to support them financially. And some states were they didn't tolerate much deviance, and they didn't particularly like disturbances, and that's what led to the creation of colonies like Connecticut, Rhode Island, because of dissenters who descended from the Puritans. They would go over here and they'd become Congregationalists. So a lot of times that's what would happen. 9 of the 13 colonies had established religions. But over time, by the 1830s, there were no religious qualifications to vote, and it was recognized that by the writing of the Constitution, there could be no state religion because each state had different religions. Anglicans were big in the middle colonies, and Puritans, Congregationalists were big up in the New England colonies, Presbyterians in certain other colonies. So there was no one religion, so the founding fathers included the Establishment Clause, which prohibits Congress from passing laws to establish a national religion. And that's kind of how it was interpreted for over 150 years. Um, the government would not provide money to, federal government would not provide tax support to a one religion. Now that doesn't mean religion didn't come into uh, connection with the national government. Oftentimes, the national government would put into laws certain things to advance religion. They would support the founding of churches. They would support missions of missionaries into the West. But by and large, there was a understanding that there would be just no national religion. Now, in a case of Everson versus Board of Education, as I mentioned, the court found that there was a fear that taxes should not be going to religious activities or institutions. Now, the court upheld the New Jersey law because it did not aid the church directly, but it provided for the safety and benefit of students because the state law said that we're going to use money to provide bus transportation of students who attended parochial schools. Parochial means schools run by churches or other religious groups. So, yeah, you can't have taxes directly going to churches. But in the case of safe transportation for students, they made this exception. Public schools cannot sponsor religious activities, and since the Engel case in 1962, known as the Regent's Prayer case, we cannot have prayers read aloud like, Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. Kind of a harmful prayer, harmless, I should say, harmless prayer. But a couple of parents were whipped into a frenzy by a power-seeking lawyer, and he wanted a name for himself, so he took the case, got it to the Supreme Court, and they struck down governments composing prayers in New York State. It wasn't the parents that objected, it was a lawyer who convinced them otherwise. And also there's been in cases like in the 1980s, you can't even have the Ten Commandments up. That doesn't make sense. It's a historical document. That was a document that the Jews used as the foundation of their faith, the foundation of their religion. I mean, we teach religions in the high schools, and to outlaw the Ten Commandments being posted, that doesn't make sense. But in the Stone case, yeah, you can't have thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal on the walls. I mean, not everybody agrees with these things. I mean, 50% of the country doesn't agree with these kinds of cases. I must admit I'm in the 50%. I don't see the harm in praying before class or having 10 commandments. I don't know. Now, you can't have moments of silence, as you recall in your high school class, you could have that. But you can't have student-led prayer before a sporting event on a public address system. Now, you can have players before the football game kneel and pray, that's fine, but they can't be led by the coach, and he can't encourage it. Now, we know that that's ignored in many cases, but that's the rule. Again, public schools, they cannot sponsor religious activities, but they can't prevent them either. So they've got to make some allowances. So here's a picture of a Bible study group. If public high school allows student clubs to use school facilities after hours, they must allow religious groups the same rights. Well, I think that's only fair. We are a religious nation, as shown by my map. Here's the leading church bodies in the areas indicated. Dark blue is Catholic, the brown would be Mormon. The reds, I think, are Baptists, and the greens, Methodists, and then up there, up north in North Dakota, Minnesota, up here would be the Lutherans. Okay. Now, in the case of evolution, this one gets a lot of attention in the last 50 years, since the 60s. But even before that, going back to the monkey trial, the Scopes monkey trial of the 20s, when the gentleman trying to teach Darwinism or evolution theory, that man developed from a lower form of species. He was forbidden. He was tried in a big trial that caught nationwide headlines on newspapers. That would be like Twitter today, and caught the attention of the entire nation. Eventually, he would be found guilty of teaching, violating the state law of Tennessee, forbidding the teaching, and fined, I think, $10. But by the 1960s, school district states wanted to get away from just teaching, let's say, the creation story. And so they started wanting to introduce such things as Darwin's theories of evolution into the classrooms. And there was a test case, much like the McCullough case. The state of Arkansas wanted to really kind of test the law, actually, of their own state, but they were uncomfortable with changing it in the state legislature. So Epperson in the school district tested it, and the lawyers took it to the courts, and this ended up being the case which overturned laws in the states that required just one particular thing to be taught. Now, really, you can't forbid the teaching of evolution. If you do, it's unconstitutional. Now, in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a movement to reintroduce teaching of what we call gods, or give the creation story, or what is called intelligent design. And the federal courts have ruled that intelligent design was religious and unconstitutional. But I don't know. I mean, I've seen some interesting videos on this. Let me share you a couple with you that on this idea.
In 1936, a brilliant Polish doctor discovered what she believed to be the biggest biblical breakthrough of the last.
Not that. Let's go. Here we go.
How did we get here? I mean, literally, not just you and me, but the whole shebang. How is any kind of life possible? The universe is a hostile place. Solar flares, cosmic rays, asteroids flying about. The odds against our existence are truly astronomical. Take it from me. I'm an astrophysicist. My job is to look out into space at stars and galaxies, trying to answer these basic, how did the universe come to be questions. Well, those who have a religious faith have an answer: God. The Earth's distance from the sun, the size of the atom, and 1,000 other things, large and small, that allow us to live and to breathe and to think, all seem perfectly tuned for our existence. To many, this design suggests a designer. But from a purely scientific point of view, the faithful have a big problem. They can offer no indisputable proof for this belief. Because of the lack of hard evidence, it's probably not surprising that over 70% of the members of the National Academy of Sciences declare themselves to be atheists. But they have a big problem too. Absent a creator, how do they account for the existence of the universe, of planet Earth, of human consciousness? How do they account for the existence of anything? Well, it turns out they have an answer, and it's become all the rage in scientific circles. It's called the multiverse, and according to many scientists, our universe isn't the whole ballgame. Far from it. These scientists argue that there's an awful lot of universes out there, not just one or two, but an infinite number of them. Let me explain. 13.8 billion years ago, there was a big bang from something unimaginably small. We don't know exactly what. The universe exploded into existence. How did it happen? Why did it happen? Doesn't matter, because it happened. Immediately after the Big Bang, the universe underwent a rapid expansion. Think of a gush of bubbles exploding from a seriously shaken soda can just after it's popped open. Cosmologists call this the theory of inflation. As the universe inflates and expands, the bubble universes grow and separate to become their own distinct entities, each with their own unique properties. In other words, new universes are spawned, and not just a handful, an infinite number of them. Some of these universes would be too cold for life and some too hot. But with an infinite number, surely one is bound to get it just right. In short, you and I are just an accident that, given enough universes, was inevitable. Oh wait, there's more. Because there are so many universes, it's very likely, according to the multiverse scenario, that everything that could possibly happen does happen in one universe or another. That girlfriend who broke up with you, you're married to her in another universe. Does this sound a bit far-fetched, a little too science fiction-y? Well, not to Nobel Prize-winning scientists like Steven Weinberg or the famed cosmologist Stephen Hawking, as well as a myriad of others who wholeheartedly endorse it. But here's what's really surprising. They endorse it knowing there's not a single shred of hard scientific evidence that supports it. And how can there be? There's no way we can access another universe. In short, a vast number of the world's most eminent scientists believe in something that hasn't been, and in all likelihood will never be proven. How does that sound to you? Probably the same way it sounds to the distinguished physicist Paul Davies, invoking an infinity of unseen universes to explain the unusual features of the one we do see is just as made up as invoking an unseen creator. The multiverse theory may be dressed up in scientific language, but in essence, it requires the same leap of faith. Or, as G.K. Chesterton quipped, when men stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing. They believe in anything. For multiverse believers, this is literally true. The same scientists who reject God's existence due to the lack of evidence pin their hopes on a theory so all-inclusive and vague, it could never be refuted. Those who believe God created the universe are intellectually honest enough to admit that they do so on the basis of faith. But those who believe in the multiverse are also keeping the faith. They just don't admit it. So let me ask you, who's taking the bigger leap? I'm Brian Keating, professor of physics at the University of California, San Diego, for Prager University.
Okay. Yeah, he makes an interesting argument for this, kind of this whole thing about what created the universe, what started everything, God, or did we descend from monkeys and descend from fish and descend from amoebas after the creation of the multiverse? But who created the multiverse? I don't know. But so far, the Supreme Court, these justices, these legal minds, they've decided what's the correct cosmology, what's the correct biology to be taught. That doesn't make sense. Yeah, they've ruled a lot of this intelligent design stuff and even teaching to the controversy as unconstitutional. I don't agree, but that's what the courts have said. But that's my personal opinion. I think we should teach the controversies. And some might say, well, let's talk about aliens. Well, okay. Are there aliens? Are we controlled by aliens? Are there aliens among us? All right, I'm willing to have that discussion. And I'll leave you with that. Let's go on then to parochial schools and discuss that. As far as religious schools or parochial schools, there is limited aid available, like the Everson case suggested in the 1940s. You can give limited transportation equipment services to, let's say, disadvantaged students. There is a test that's enunciated in a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman. And in that case, they came up with three primary things they look at. The court did that basically starting in the 40s, 50s, into the 70s. During that time period, they developed a lot of these tests. We'll get into this in more detail in chapter 5, but the courts look at things and they ask themselves, is the school aid secular in nature? Secular means non-religious. Is the financial aid just non-religious or secular? Number two, does it neither advance nor inhibit religion? So are we just taking a kind of hands-off neutral stance? And then third, does it avoid an excessive entanglement with religion, the financial aid? Well, what does that mean? Well, that's a good question. And cases still go before the Supreme Court. There we go, that's East. Deciding, okay, is this an excessive entanglement with religion or not? Now, school vouchers are an interesting case. These are educational. This is recent, meaning in constitutional interpretation terms. In the last 20, 25 years, there's been a real recognition that public schools are failing. There's lots of reasons why. Some do, some don't, but overall, they could be better. So there's been suggestions, let's do this, let's do that, let's do charter, let's do vouchers. And charter vouchers have a lot of arguments for them. Now, vouchers are schools or certificates that are given to parents, and then the parents can take those and go give the money to a particular school that they want their kid to be enrolled in. And in the Zellman case, in I think it was Ohio, the city of Cleveland, I believe, decided that they would provide up to $2,200 to a family that was low income, and they could use the funds to send their children to a private school. Well, 95% sent their kids to a private school. So the courts considered this constitutional. Now, some states won't allow it. I think Florida, in their court, they said, no, we're not. They tried to do it, but Florida ruled that it was a violation of their state constitution. So it's really up to the states. Okay. Now that was the Establishment Clause. So you cannot establish a religion, but government can do certain things. Government can put "In God We Trust" on coins. God can allow missionaries and encourage missionaries to go out and do mission work. God can, government can have pastors in the military, and we can say, prayers before public meetings of the city council, the state legislature, the county commissioner's court. Those things are allowed. They don't establish a religion, but you can have you can't have a little prayer before class. You can't in public schools. You can't put a 10 Commandments on the wall in your classroom. You cannot, as a student, lead a prayer over a PA system at a football game. Now, students can kneel and pray on their own with no guidance. Those kind of things. You can't teach creationism in school, but you can teach Islam, Judaism, Christianity as part of a religion. We're going to study religions today. That's kind of odd, isn't it? And you really have to teach evolution, and you're required to, because judges know better about biology, I guess. All right, so, and you can give some money to religious schools as long as it's for certain things, and you can provide vouchers as a local government entity for families who want to put their kids in a better school, or what the parents perceive as a better school. Now, the Free Exercise Clause, it's the second part of the First Amendment, says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion nor interfering with the free exercise thereof. So government cannot pass laws interfering with your free exercise up to a point. Obviously, we can't allow sacrifice of humans. I mean, these kinds of absurd things. But you can worship as you believe. That's up to you. You just can't act in any way you want to. It's not absolute. You have a right to practice your beliefs, but there are some limits. Now, in a Reynolds case in 1878, the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons who practice polygamy, that's having more than one wife, that was found to be unconstitutional. Even though Utah was a territory, the courts found that no, you can't raise practices above laws, and we had a law against it. Now, by the 1890s, the Latter-day Saints prohibited new polygamous marriages. Another practice is that parents who believe that you shouldn't be vaccinated or your child shouldn't be treated if they're injured. You got to be careful with that, because if you're a parent and you refuse treatment for your children, it depends on what the child is suffering from. If parents don't allow life-saving treatment and the child suffers something, that can be considered a serious crime. So parents got to be very careful about that. Also, vaccination as a public health measure, states are now starting to pass laws that don't allow parents to opt out. There's the big state of California, Mississippi, and several other states now. You cannot opt out, except if a physician says that your child should opt out because of allergies to vaccines. But the right to refuse vaccination based on religion is somewhat limited. Now, as far as religion in the workplace, there's laws on the books that the courts enforce through their judicial decisions, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which does require employers to accommodate employees' religious practices. So yes, up to a certain point, you can wear beards if you're a Rastafarian or Hindu, or if you need to pray during a certain time of day. There are certain things they can make accommodations for. Now, under the Obamacare Act of 2010, this brought up an interesting controversy with regards to insurance and contraception and birth control and churches and religious hospitals and so on that don't believe in that kind of thing, that don't believe in abortion. And this went so far as to involve a privately held company, Hobby Lobby, which was owned by a Christian family, and they felt they should be exempt from requirements to provide abortion in their insurance package for their employees. And the courts didn't get that case and didn't rule on it because the administration under Obama decided that they would make an exception for them, I believe. And then the Supreme Court held also that, yes, they could be exempted from the requirements if the owner objected on religious grounds. So that's still ongoing, this controversy about Obamacare and the requirements of what you must offer your employees as far as health insurance. Okay, what we'll do is we'll stop there, and I'll pick it up with the freedom of expression. And remember, we went over the civil rights and civil liberties, what they mean. There are limitations on government action. Civil rights are what government must do, and legal privileges are what governments give, but they can take them away. Then we have three basic safeguards in our Constitution. The habeas corpus means the jailer must present you before the court and charge you with a crime. Otherwise, got to let you go. Bill of attainder means legislatures cannot pass laws basically outlawing you. You've got to get a right to a trial. And the ex post facto doesn't increase punishment or punish you for something you did before. You can't pass those kinds of things. So these are prohibitions on governments. And then the first 10 amendments, they expanded what governments cannot do and what governments must do in the case of, let's say, criminal procedures. And now, in the beginning and for over 100 years, the amendments and Three safeguards in the original Constitution applied to the national government. This was interpreted that way in the Barron versus Baltimore case. Now, in the 1860s, after the Civil War in 1868, with the adoption of the 13th Amendment, this began to change, and the Due Process Clause requires that states, before they take life, liberty, or property, they must provide every citizen due process of law. Originally intended to provide equality in the courts, before the courts, between African American males and white American males, but it's come to mean a lot more than that in these two areas, substantive and procedural due process. What has happened over the last mainly 100 years is the courts have slowly, what they've done is incorporated certain First 10 Amendment rights, liberties, and applied them to the states and said, states, you've got to do this, states, you've got to do that. State of Texas, state of Alabama, state of Georgia, state of California, and all the rest of them. And that applies to all you states, by the way. Well, they've got to, in a procedure, the courts will focus on life, liberty, and property, and they'll look at whether the courts and the executive branch treated somebody equitably, fairly. And like in the right to trial, right to a lawyer in capital punishment cases, or the right to a public trial in Ray Oliver case, or in the Wolf versus California, no unreasonable searches and seizures. So those all have to do with processes, ways of doing business. And so the Supreme Court has said, this is the way you're going to do business from now on, state. And we get this authority because we interpret the Constitution as Marshall said, and the 14th Amendment says, no state shall deprive anybody of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Well, this is the procedural due process of law that states must give you. Now, substantive due process, this one's a little trickier. Courts have made up this legal fiction, really, that the content of legislation violates a person's due process. Well, it's not really a process in a way, but I guess you could stretch it when you say, well, speaking is a process. Like in the Gitlow case, they said, well, legislature of New York, you can't make a law determining what this guy can say if it doesn't incite a riot or whatever. So this court is saying, well, the substance of, in essence, what they're becoming is a council of revision, like Madison originally proposed back in 1787. The super legislature, that's not what they are. They shouldn't be, and they never were intended to be a super legislature, but essentially that's what they're doing. Or a super executive, they're vetoing legislation. It's a little tricky thing, though. Okay, we went over the other liberties, what non-citizens can seek and don't have, and then the freedom of religion. Remember, the Establishment Clause says no national religion, but that doesn't mean governments cannot get involved in certain things. They do, and they have, and they still are. But they can't write a little prayer and have kids recite it. They can't have 10 Commandments. Can't have sporting event prayers led by students over a PA system. You can have moments of silence. You got to teach evolution. Creationism is out, evolution's in. Intelligent design is another name for God. We can't teach that. And aid to parochial schools or religious schools is allowed, but you got to have three things: check, 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 before you can do that. And vouchers and free exercise. So we'll stop there and pick it up with free expression. And I'll see you after the break.